Hello, I am Dr. D. Elwood Dunn, author of A Liberian Life. I am a retired professor and have written extensively about Liberia, her history, and her place in Africa and the world. The film you are about to watch recounts the early days of the Peace Corps and the work of its volunteers in Liberia in the 1960s. The Peace Corps was founded in 1961 after President John F. Kennedy challenged America's youth to serve their country and the cause of peace by living and working in the developing world. Thousands of young people enthusiastically stepped up to participate in this new program. Liberia was one of the first countries to benefit from the Peace Corps' work and mission. In 1962, after 3 months of training, the first group of volunteers, all teachers, landed at Roberts International Airport just outside the Liberian capital of Monrovia. I first encountered Peace Corps volunteers in 1963 as an undergraduate student at Cuttington College in Swakoko. There I met 3 young, idealistic Americans who were assigned to work at the college. Like many Liberians of my generation, I remain indebted to President Kennedy and those volunteers who helped prepare us for what we were able to do for our country. Now, 60 years later, some of these amazing volunteers are sharing their experiences and telling us in their own words what it was like to be Group 1.
I'm Geraldine Marcus Kennedy. I was born and raised in McKeesport, Pennsylvania.
Jack and Jean Wilson. I grew up in a rural area, small town in southern Michigan.
And I grew up in Lakewood, a suburb of Cleveland.
My name is Lois Hurst. I grew up in Miamisburg, Ohio.
And my name is Steve Hurst, and I grew up in Miamisburg, Ohio as well.
I'm Jerry Adams. I grew up in a very small rural town in northern Iowa. I served in Liberia in Monrovia, 1962 to 1964.
During his campaign for election, President Kennedy was talking at colleges, and one evening he was scheduled to come to the University of Michigan, and he was late, and people said, "Oh, surely won't be anybody there," and he insisted on going. And when they did get there near midnight, 10,000 people were waiting, and he did one of his most stirring speeches.
How many of you who are going to be doctors are willing to spend your days in Ghana, technicians or engineers? How many of you are willing to work in the foreign service and spend your lives traveling around the world? On your willingness to do that, not merely to serve 1 year or 2 years in the service, but on your willingness to contribute part of your life to this country, I think will depend the answer whether a free society can. I think it can, and I think Americans are willing to contribute, but the effort must be far greater than we've ever made in the past. And therefore, I'm delighted to come to Michigan, this university, because unless we have those resources in this school, unless you comprehend the nature of what is being asked of you, this country can't possibly move through the next 10 years in a period of relative strength.
I, at the time, worked on the college newspaper and was following his campaign. And so when I saw that the next day that he was going to be at Johnstown speaking there, I got myself from Penn State to Johnstown and had my press pass and got into the front row with the real reporters. And he came down the aisle and shook hands with people and was hustled along. And when he got to the front row, he turned and he looked right at me. He looked right at my eyes. And he had started talking about this wonderful organization.
When President Kennedy made his speech at the University of Michigan, it got us all excited.
You know, it was a good time in the U.S. People were thinking positively. Kennedy was a part of that.
Underlying all of that was my interest in being of some service to my community and to my country, although I couldn't imagine going into the military. And then John Kennedy came along.
The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
John Kennedy came along with his inspiring ideas and lit a fire that really got me interested in participating. And as true with so many people of my age at that time, I volunteered.
I had another year on campus after that, waiting. I could not go in 61 because I hadn't graduated yet, but I certainly did as soon as I could.
We were very idealistic. We were interested in travel. We were interested in being helpful to other people.
It was an opportunity to do something different and get out of Southern Ohio, I have to say.
That's for sure.
We both applied at the same time, and I got my acceptance a couple of weeks before Steve did.
Well, I knew she would go, and I thought she was going to leave me far behind, living an experience that would lead her to forget all about me. And I'm sure they wanted her because she had a teaching background. And then I got my acceptance and big relief.
We did get married very soon after that. And then basically, I had never been on an airplane before, so we flew to Pittsburgh.
I got a telegram inviting me to go to Liberia. And I had to rush to an encyclopedia to find out what a Liberia was. Turns out it was a where, and learned that it was a very unique place.
I basically knew nothing about Liberia, and we, of course, went to the Encyclopedia Britannica right away to find out. We weren't sure if it was Libya or Liberia, and we had to locate it.
What at the time typically was referred to as darkest Africa. And the more I learned about it, the more interested I became. And of course, at training, learned a whole lot more about Liberia. It was really remarkable. We came from all over the place. Nobody knew anybody else in our group until we were together. But we quickly became close to each other in a variety of ways. And a small group, I think 3 or 4 of the not quite 100 people in our group, started a newsletter that I still find remarkable, how they found the time to do it, because we were in classes almost 12 hours a day, it seems like. They started a newsletter that included all kinds of things, worldview articles written by members of our group, things about anticipating going to Liberia, things about what they'd already done, belief systems, and whatever. And I don't know how many were published, but considering we were only in training for, I think, 10 weeks or something like that, It was a remarkable number of such things, included newly generated cartoons, all sorts of quips and so on. So that was one element.
Our training was 2 months long, and we were really not surprised when we got to Liberia. We'd been so fully filled in on everything about Liberia, the people, the history, the geography, the conditions of life there. So it really wasn't a surprise to us when we arrived.
I would have to agree with that. I didn't think of, I can't think of anything that we weren't prepared for.
We were excited. It was challenging, and particularly after we went through training, we felt even more challenged and educated. I always said I learned more in those 60 days than I did in any semester in college. And I think that's true. True in terms of learning something about another culture, about our own American history, which was part of the training, about teacher training, which is what we were being prepared to do. All of us in the group were either going to be primary or secondary teachers. I don't think we were just excited. I would say there was no anxiety. I suppose there's always some anxiety when you go into a new situation, but we felt we were part of a team. We were, there were nearly 100 of us going. And we had met the director. And it was just exciting.
We had lots of people come to talk to us. Liberians came in, the Secretary of Education came. I mean, it was the first group.
The ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, the Liberian ambassador.
Right, and so we just had lots of opportunities to learn from them, and we had some special things like learning how to give ourselves a shot because they were worried about snakes, and we had to be able to give ourselves a shot so that if we got bit by a snake, we had anti-venom shot. And another thing that was interesting was we had to role play talking to a communist. This is the beginning of it's the time in our history, right? And we were not in a situation as Peace Corps volunteers were saying in Indonesia, where there were actually communists there in Liberia, but they were intent on us being able to take care of that as well.
They were very concerned about psychological issues, and so we went through, I don't know how many MMPI and half a dozen other things, and people were pulled off to the side and interviewed by psychologists. At one point, the psychologists wanted to interview the married couples separately, and some of us said, no, we go together or we don't go. And
so they
backed off.
When I got my telegram from Sergeant Shriver, it was inviting me to train with the group going to the Ivory Coast. And in those days, we still called it the Ivory Coast. And they were training at University of Wisconsin at Madison. So I went there, and of course, in the Ivory Coast had been a former French colony, and French was the language we would be working in. So French studies were very important. The Peace Corps had imported Madame from Paris so that our French would be as correct and wonderful as possible. And by midway in training, she decided that there were 4 of us whose French language was just not up to snuff. Another woman, Julia Moore, and I accepted the transfer to Liberia. So Julia and I arrived in Pittsburgh. The group had already, of course, been organized and bonded, and they were, a larger group than we had had in Madison. They had a sports team. They had a newsletter. They knew who the singers were and had shows. They knew who the Smart Kids were. And, it was a very well-established society that we were moving into. Early on, Julia and I were sharing a room there, and sometimes we would just whisper in the dark in our room. Maybe this was the Peace Corps testing us, testing us to see if we could handle disruption and change.
I grew up in Iowa, where there was a lot of heat in the summer and often a lot of moisture, but no way prepared to step off that airplane into what felt like a sauna. And of course, we were dressed in our best because we were being received officially. So that was shocking and a struggle. But there were so many other things that were just different from anything that I was prepared for.
There were 92 of us who went. Among those was 1 Asian American and 9 African Americans, which made up 10% of the group. 27 were single women, 43 were single men, and 11 were married couples. We came from 25 states. California had the most, with 14. California, New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania totaled 43. But people came from places as small as Marble Rock, Idaho, with 411 residents, to New York City. It was absolutely representative of a very, very broad section of our country. 81% had a BA upon entering the Peace Corps, and 12% finished their BAs afterwards. So that meant that 93% of us had at least a BA. The oldest person was 61 years old, and the majority were under 26. We were all teachers. We were assigned variously from elementary, middle school, high school, and I believe 2 or 3 people were assigned to Cuttington College. In both schools that I taught in St. Teresa's Convent School in Monrovia the first year, and at Loch Carey Mission the second year, French was one of my main topics. So in addition to social studies and English, the schools required that I teach French. So I thought this was some sort of a message from the universe that I was really meant to be in Liberia.
We were posted at Swin Industrial Academy on the hill above a small village, really, named Swin. And it was a mission school, as were a number of other schools in Liberia at that point. And it was run by the National Baptist Church. So there were 4 or 5 at various times missionaries there. And we taught junior and senior high school. Jack taught English, I taught social studies, history, and you also taught.
Well, second level, I taught boys physical education and manual arts. That's not something that I or my father would have ever thought I was capable of doing. But one of the things we learned quickly in Liberia was that we knew how to do things we didn't know we knew how to do. And sometimes we got put in a position to try them out.
besides teaching social studies history, I also taught home ec and girls PE.
I taught English and language arts to middle school students.
And I taught science and mathematics to junior high students. And this was in Tapata, which is in Nimba County in the central part of Liberia. And when I say junior high students or elementary students, the students were mostly our age or older and had families.
Many of them found that their parents wouldn't support them and they had to come of age to leave. And then they were able to come into Tapata, which was the largest city in the region where we were. And then they were able to go to school.
Yeah, when she says large city, Tapata was a trading center of maybe 1,000 people. Our students, to say they were highly motivated is an understatement. I mean, many of them had left home, run away from home. Their parents wanted to keep them at home to help with farming, and they wanted to build a new life with education. So they were certainly not a problem to motivate.
Perhaps in some ways, the most shocking is that I was assigned to work in Monrovia. I had grown up in a house without electricity and without running water until I helped put them in as a kid, and thought that I was among the best prepared to live in a village somewhere without those utilities, and to be put in the city just seemed somehow wrong. I suggested that to the people in charge at the time and was told that I had a choice of going where I was assigned or going home. And I didn't think that was a good option, so I stayed. As I was adjusting to the idea of being in the city and giving up the image I had of myself working in a village someplace that fit with all of what we learned in training, I looked around for something to do after hours. School hours didn't run terribly long. So I learned somehow, I don't remember how, that there was a psychiatric hospital outside the city and that they might have some use for somebody like me. I had worked in the St. Louis State Hospital one summer during college, so I'd had some experience and exposure to psychiatric patients. So I met with the director, who happened to be Harvard trained, but an Israeli psychiatrist. And we talked and he asked me what I knew how to do. And I told him the little bit that I had done in addition to being an orderly in that hospital in St. Louis. And he said, well, you could come out and be our group therapist. And I quickly said, I'm not qualified to be a group therapist. He assured me that he would supervise me and guide me, and that if I met with patients, I would be doing therapy. So I went out a couple afternoons a week for the rest of that first year. I didn't even know he did it, but at some point he petitioned the Peace Corps to reassign me to what was then called Catherine Mills Rehabilitation Center. And I ended up reassigned there and worked the second year full-time in that setting, which turned out to be absolutely fascinating in all sorts of ways.
Within a month of when we arrived, a number of the boys and one of the teachers came to me and said, Mr. Wilson, for physical education, what you need to do is teach us basketball. I was certainly no expert on basketball. I played a little in junior high school. I played a little intramural later, but I was no expert at that. Boys wanted to do it, and so figured out how to do it. I took a group of them with this other teacher and went out in the bush and cut down a couple of trees and brought them back and dug deep holes in the ground at one end of a flat laterite area. And then this other teacher was able to work with a blacksmith to make a rim. Boys in the industrial arts class fabricated a backboard. And so within 6 weeks, we were working on basketball. And there were other Peace Corps volunteers in Monrovia who also were interested in basketball and helped form teams at their schools. And so we formed a basketball league. And we were the boys from the bush, but we went to town and beat them all and won the first national high school basketball championship in October of 1963. And then played the All-Stars from all the other teams. And that was a big deal because that game was broadcast over ELWA, I think.
No,
ELBC, maybe, right? And Angine took or money bus loads of girls to some of those games. So anyway, that was that was my claim to fame.
What was really important to us early on was that we discovered that there was such a thing as African literature, there was such a thing as African history. And we just bought whatever we could in Liberia. There was a Muslim bookstore in Monrovia, and I got Basil Davidson's 2 books, Black Africa, Rediscovered and Lost Cities of Africa. And I was appalled, not only that I never learned anything about African civilizations, but that the students hadn't either. And so one of the things I very quickly did was figure out how to teach them about African countries. We had a day off because all these countries were getting independence. And so we had a day off when Uganda got its independence. We had a day off when Malawi got its independence. Some of the students dressed up as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Sekou Touré of Guinea, and President Tubman. And I made a map of Africa. Every student had to learn all the countries of Africa and the capitals and the leaders and so forth. And they got into that. We got into that because we had a good time.
I've been always interested in theater, and it always seemed, again, a way of connecting with people. So when I went out to Loch Carey, I had a friend who was able to send me the script for The Wizard of Oz. And it just seemed perfect for the range of students. We had students at Loch Carey, even though I taught in the high school portion, but we had students there from the first grade onward. And we did the play, and it seemed like this was getting to be a bigger production than the chapel at Loch Carey could handle. I was seeing, bright lights Broadway. We were getting so elaborate. The students made costumes. We talked about it. We rehearsed, and my sense was that this needed to be available to more people than just other students, or maybe the people in the village near Loch Carey. So there was a new city hall in Monrovia, and I got permission to have our play at City Hall. And we put the kids in costume, and we drove to Monrovia, and we went through the streets of Monrovia, blowing the horn and calling out to people saying, "Come see the play, come see the play, come to City Hall," and getting, advertising our play. And it was tremendously successful. Maybe not an overwhelmingly full auditorium as I had hoped, but certainly a very good crowd and a very appreciative crowd. We had it was the first time for these kids to be on an actual stage with a curtain and backstage and all the protocols of being in the theater production. We got somebody who played musical interludes, and all of it came together. It was thrilling for me as the play director, but it also was a memorable moment for all of the students and the people we were able to bring in to help with the crew and pull it off.
A memory that comes to me, which maybe illustrated the resourcefulness, if nothing else, of librarians with a more difficult life than we're used to. One day, I wanted to catch a ride down to the capital city to buy some groceries. And our neighbor had a truck, a Ford F-150 truck, that he would haul supplies to the stores in town. So he was going down to town, down to Monrovia, the capital city, the next morning. So I got up early and joined him, and it was during rainy season. And we got to the first river, and the bridge across the river was completely submerged. I mean, the water was that high. There was just a brown torrent, no bridge in sight. And I thought, well, I guess we turn back and head home here. No, there was a raft that was taking people across the river. And so the driver, our neighbor, Tarpole Johnson was his name, and Tarpole got out and his assistant got out, and they got rags out of the back of the truck, and one of them pounded a rag down the carburetor, and another one pounded a rag up the exhaust pipe. And then Tarpole got a big heavy rope out of the truck bed and he tied it to the bumper. And then we walked down to the raft, and I followed them down to the raft, and he had the rope over his shoulder. We all got on the raft, and as the raft is taking us across the torrent, he's paying out the rope. We get to the other side, and he walks up the shoreline until he's approximately even with the truck sitting on the other side of the river. And he calls together all the people that are standing around there, and they all get a hold of the rope and they start pulling on the truck, and they pull it down into the flood, coming across the bridge until the truck disappears into the torrent. Everybody's singing a work song, pulling and pulling and pulling on the rope, and pretty soon the truck emerges on the other side. Pull it up onto the dry land. He opens the door and lets all the water out. Then they pull the rags out of the carburetor and the exhaust pipe. He gets in and cranks the engine for a few minutes. It catches, and off we go to the capital city.
The first major development in the United States that hit us in Liberia, first of all, we had very poor communication from the outside world. Voice of America was the main one, and at best, it tended to be scratchy, static-laden stuff on whatever radios we could get a hold of. But at some point, we caught wind of the Cuban Missile Crisis and found ourselves with very little information and a great deal of concern. We had grown up with hiding under our desks in case of nuclear attack by the Soviet Union, as if hiding under a desk would matter. And so we were all, I think, instilled with the idea that that was a very risky, dangerous thing. And so we found ourselves standing on the beach in Monrovia, looking to the west to see if a mushroom cloud was going to appear on the horizon. Somehow managing to forget that there was a whole lot of earth between us and Cuba.
The time that we felt the most far away was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we understood that it was possible Russia and the US might be obliterated, but we might be okay in West Africa. And so that was a scary, 6 days or however long that was. and then other events. I mean, the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's speech. We saw that on a video in Monrovia somehow.
Well, USIA.
Yeah, USIA, I guess. Our students were very interested in all the news. They were aware of what was going on in the United States in terms of race. And, one of them said do white Americans think we have tails or something? I mean, they knew that there was discrimination against Black people in the U.S. and they were concerned about, and we were too. And that's something that we talked about as volunteers, that we would, when we went back to the U.S., for some of us it had been important before we went, but it would be important to us to engage in those events to some extent when we got home.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The other horrendously unsettling thing was the news of what happened to JFK, who was, after all, our inspiration. And I say our, meaning literally everybody in our group. Happened one evening, a bunch of us were playing basketball at the YMCA in Monrovia with some Liberian youth. And the rumor started spreading around in the gymnasium about something awful happening to JFK. And we kind of ignored it because, of course, we couldn't believe such a thing. We played a little bit more and the rumor got louder and more persistent. And so finally we stopped, to the dismay of our opposing team, because they wanted to keep playing. We hustled to some place where we could find a radio and got outside and with as unencumbered as we could to the radio so it could get a signal. And through the scratches, we would hear things like,
This is the Voice of America broadcasting worldwide. To repeat, President Kennedy is
JFK or John Kennedy, and then shot and then assassinated, and all words that were jumbled, but because we couldn't hear much. But bit by bit, we got more and more of the information. It became clear that indeed our dear president had been shot. And then we got more word about what was happening to Oswald, and it became even more frightening at the thought that law and order had broken down completely in the United States.
We were in Liberia when President Kennedy was assassinated. And it was on a Friday, and a group of Peace Corps volunteers from surrounding communities had come to our house, and we were all sitting having dinner. And someone switched on the BBC, and it was the end of the BBC broadcast, and all we heard was,
Hello, London. I've just heard from Dallas that the president is still alive, but in critical condition. Now, I'll just pause a second to have a look at a message I've just received from Dallas. President Kennedy is dead.
And you can imagine all of us sitting there. What does this mean? What's going to happen?
and our students started coming, just dozens coming to the door, tears streaming down their face saying, "Will you be going home? Teacher, will you be going home?" We didn't know what to expect. And the next day, I went into town to get some supplies at the store, and the Malinke man, who was the leader of the people who called Muslims to prayer, was standing in the line ahead of me. And he was a very tall man. He looked like a black Abraham Lincoln. And I was daunted by him. He never spoke to me. I didn't know if he spoke English or anything, but I was kind of afraid of him. And he finished his purchase, and he turned around and saw me, and he tipped his head to me, and he said, "Your president was a very great man. I am very sorry." and then he walked on, and it was a moment I'll never forget.
Well, I do remember very clearly when a boy came from the boys' dormitory and just, said, Mimar, Mivo, Miparkel. You heard Kennedy died. Kennedy shot. And we weren't sure we understood him. And we weren't, it was so out of context and out of anything that we might have ever anticipated. He said, for true, Kennedy shot. So we had another volunteer who lived in Brewerville town, not far from the mission. And we contacted him, and he came over to our house and brought his shortwave radio. And we tried to get information about it. And sure enough, the president had been assassinated. It was taking the rug right out from under us. He was the reason we were there, and it seemed inconceivable that this could have happened. We pulled the curtains. The Liberians have mourning as a very familiar practice in their lives. People die, children die frequently. They were very sympathetic to us. They were very respectful of us. We closed our blinds, we stayed in, we listened to that radio. And then through our network, we learned that there was going to be a memorial service at City Hall, and President Tubman was going to speak. So we hurried, we made black dresses. We didn't have a whole black outfit among us, but we did. And we sewed black armbands in the Liberian tradition, which we would wear for a month afterwards. And we went to Monrovia for this ceremony at City Hall, and then left that and went to the Catholic mission, where the bishop reserved seats in the front for Americans. He arranged for it, he didn't personally, but we were there early, and we filed in, and we were ushered to the front. And his sermon focused on us, and he spoke of Kennedy's children among us. By the time he actually started, the mission was packed. The little church was packed, and people were at all the windows trying to lean in and trying to see. There were Liberian dignitaries behind us, and then the regular people who were standing, crowding around, trying in any way to see this event. He did a Requiem Mass, and we filed out in silence from that. And the three of us went home to Brewerville and spent several days more there, just sleeping and trying to comprehend what had happened.
We just were lucky in our opportunities to continue to know Liberians, and because we were at a university. So I was at a university. So the last important person in terms of Liberians who appeared was Masoko Fala, came into our lives in about 2004, and we were his host family, and we are on the board of his.
And one of the last graduates of Swin Industrial Academy before it was destroyed during
the war, right? So that was meant to be, right? So we just have all these connections that we've been able to maintain over the years. And for us, the impact of Peace Corps was the relationships that we built with people, and it just was. Has been an incredible
and when
experience.
People say Peace Corps is life-changing, certainly has been for us.
Yeah.
We've had numerous full-fledged reunions with lots of people getting together. We've had a number of various people have traveled from one place to another and used Peace Corps volunteers as their hostel, so to speak. That connection continued with email. There are days when I've had 4 and 5 and even 10 emails. Somebody will say something that provokes something else, and other people will tune in. And more recently, with the pandemic and Zoom arriving into our lives, we are offered the opportunity to meet with each other. And typically 20 or so people will be together, jabbering away about whatever, anything from politics to who's doing what. Overriding it all for me personally is just the recognition of what an incredible group of people I was able to be with. Even now, at the ages we all are, numerous people are doing just remarkable things and continue to serve the communities, continue to be engaged, and continue to share with the rest of us. And it's clearly a family in every sense.
Group 1 are models of what President Kennedy called the third goal. They brought back what they learned about the world and applied it to their lives in the United States. Geraldine Kennedy wrote books about the Peace Corps and her experience crossing the Sahara with 4 other Peace Corps women. Their story was reported in the New York Times and Life magazine. Geraldine started her own publishing company, Clover Park Press, married another Peace Corps volunteer, and raised 3 children. Her book, The Liberia One Storybook, was the inspiration for this documentary. Jerry Adams, largely because of his experience at the Catherine Mills Psychiatric Institution in Liberia, was accepted to graduate school and received a doctorate in clinical psychology. He taught, wrote about, and practiced psychology for more than 30 years, focusing on child, adolescent, and family psychology. After retiring from the private sector, he served for another 20 years as preceptor for the Navy Drug and Alcohol Counselor School. He raised a family with his wife, Julie, in California. After Jack Wilson joined the Peace Corps staff, he and Angeline lived in Sierra Leone and Fiji. Angeline was later a professor at the University of Kentucky for more than 30 years, and Jack worked as an environmental protection administrator for the state of Kentucky. They have written Voices from the Peace Corps, and with co-authors, Voices of African Immigrants in Kentucky, both based on oral histories. The Wilsons continue to serve on the board of Dr. Misoka Fala's Refuge Place International near Monrovia. After leaving the Peace Corps, Steve and Lois Hurst spent 11 years working for the Havasupai tribe in their village on the floor of the Grand Canyon. During their time with the Havasupai, the Hursts laid the groundwork for the largest restoration of land Congress has ever returned to a tribal community, nearly 250,000 acres. Lois also directed all the Havasupai education programs, and Steve became their tribal secretary. In addition to other books, Steve is the author of I Am the Grand Canyon, the story of the Havasupai people, and Lois provided photos for the book. They live in Flagstaff, Arizona, where they remain active in community affairs and continue their relationship with the Havasupai tribe. The Peace Corps organization continued to work in Liberia until 1990, when the outbreak of civil war forced the last volunteers to be evacuated. Many of the early volunteers formed a group called Friends of Liberia that spoke for Liberia in the United States during the war and returned to observe the Liberian election in 1997. Several smaller groups of Peace Corps response volunteers have worked in Liberia since the end of the war, leaving after the outbreak of Ebola and later the COVID pandemic. Friends of Liberia continues to work with Liberians in education and health, training and awarding small grants to community projects. The Peace Corps plans to return volunteers to Liberia in 2023.